Debates on IVF and euthanasia have captured the nation in the wake of advancing medical technologies. How should Catholics respond? Reverend Tad Pacholczyk is the senior ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia. Dr. Mariele Courtois is the director of the Center of Technology and Human Dignity at Benedictine College. Listen in as they examine in depth a Catholic perspective on the beginning and end of human life. Benedictine College is transforming culture in America, one conversation at a time. From our studios in Atchison, Kansas, these are the Benedictine Dialogues.
Father Tad, thank you so much for visiting us here at Benedictine College.
Thank you, Mariele. It's great to be able to join you. I look forward to this interview, and I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of ground.
Yes, and I thought that we could start out with you telling us a bit about your journey into bioethics and why you think it's an important field and what has prepared you to be an important speaker in this area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the elements that was important to me personally in sort of getting a good formation around this area was to develop an expertise in science. It seems to me if you're talking about bioethics, the bio part, it really is helpful to know some of the more detailed science. And I was interested in the molecular biology, cell biology, some of these areas, the biochemistry. And so, I did kind of a deep dive in that and then did a doctoral work in neuroscience. And, people were always saying to me, oh, so you studied all that science and then you figured out that you were going to be a priest, right? And I said, well, no, it actually was the other way around. I first figured out I was called to be a priest, but I realized for some reason that I had to bring science into the priesthood. In a sense, science is a whole language of its own. I think you'd agree. It's like Russian or Greek. It's got its own grammar and syntax. It's the kind of reality that, in order to be able to interact well with professionals in that field, you've got to pick up elements of the language. So I just felt this would be a very valuable investment. And, I'm very glad that I did, because I must say right away when I started in public speaking, one of the most requested areas that I spoke on was embryonic stem cell research. And this was back around 2002. So this was just brand new. And there was a very small body of medical literature, scientific literature on stem cells. It was, a body of literature that was small enough that I, in fact, was able to more or less stay on top of it as it was, developing. So that was kind of amazing. Now, of course, it's much too big for one person to really keep track of everything. But the fact that I came to it with a background in neuroscience, I had done cloning of genes that are expressed in the brain. I had done DNA sequencing. That kind of work fed right into the bioethics, easily. And the fact then that when I was over in Rome as a student preparing to become a priest, I had the opportunity to, do the deep dive again into the ethics, the bioethics, the moral theology, and sort of make sure that that was well addressed prior to, working in the area and kind of speaking publicly on it.
It's so helpful to have that science background to help offer a bridge for explaining to people some of the rising ethical questions and helping them to have a language to understand it, to think about their own views on these topics. So it's really something that's impressive and helpful to these discussions.
Yeah, I agree. And, one of the things I'm doing now a lot of is sort of speaking with people from the press. And there's new stuff that's coming down the pike. I mean, there was a paper not long ago about a type of development of gametes, sex cells, in a way that's completely unorthodox. It actually involves a cloning step. And the technology is quite complex. This came out of Oregon Health Sciences University. So, I had a couple of news reporters contacting me about this, and I had to spend some time reading the original paper, deciphering, what really is it that they're doing, and where are the ethical lines here that have been transgressed. It turns out there's multiple ethical lines because, of course, this involves using young human beings in an exploitative fashion to ultimately then derive gametes that are then used to produce new human beings. So you're kind of doing a double step of producing humans. But anyway, figuring all of this out and having the opportunity to, having the pressure, thankfully, from the media and then I have to typically write maybe a paragraph or 2 paragraphs that gives a few sound bites that'll be useful for what they're putting together. So there's a lot of work that goes into that, and it helps keep me current. So the science background has been very helpful in precisely that way, that I don't need to just read reports that are already out there. I can go to the original scientific paper, and in most instances, if it's roughly within my domain, I'm able to ferret out the key points.
Yeah, and to be able to translate that for the general public is really helpful. One of the big questions in bioethics that it tries to respond to are different technological developments and what they mean for the task of healthcare to help steward life well, both at its beginning stages, the end of life, and in the middle as well. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of the concerns in end of life first, and then we'll also talk about beginning of life ethics. But there's a lot of discussion about medical aid in dying. What are some of your comments about this ethical question, and what do you think would be helpful for people who are discerning these big decisions at the end of life?
Yeah, I like the way you frame the question, because you say, these duties to steward life. And that's really a key word. Steward, we're stewards. We've received life as a gift. And I think we have been trained to almost have an attitude of, this is my life and I'm in charge kind of thing. And it's like, well, even there, come on, let's talk first principles. You didn't give yourself life. Mysteriously, each of us have received life in a type of giftedness that we don't even understand. There's some of the philosophers talk about us sort of being thrown or cast into being. And we know that's true. We had no say in our arriving on the scene. So this automatically tells you that there are obligations. This is not our project. This is not our willfulness. And so the questions of right and wrong really become preeminent here. And there are possibilities for some very grave violations, one person against another. Medical aid in dying is an example of a physician helping somebody else by writing a prescription for a toxin so that person can, with their own hand, ingest the toxin and kill themselves. Obviously, he's cooperating in evil as he writes that prescription if he does it in a knowing way. And then you can have it, go one level higher, which is that the physician doesn't just write the prescription. He holds the syringe and plunges it into your vein to, inject it himself, and that's euthanasia. And both of these represent a radical failure to steward that life, and especially the fact that it's a physician or a medical professional who's being drawn upon to carry out these dastardly deeds and to really undercut the very essence of his own vocation as a healer. So it's a contradiction in terms, first and foremost. And I think from there, then we go to the sort of bigger question about, does it make sense as a society to be legalizing this? And what happens to our lawmakers and those in the legal profession as this sort of approach gains traction? The pressure comes to bear on them to pass laws that will provide protections for physicians so that they cannot be sued for causing harm to others. And it's like, well, wait a minute, this is all upside down and backwards, because we need to have, reasonable malpractice laws for when physicians are not responsible. Unfortunately, they're not always responsible. And this is a prime example of them failing in their mission, and they should be absolutely held accountable. And now lawyers and our legislators are being dragged in sideways to craft these types of laws to assure that there's not the possibility of prosecution of these practitioners of MAID and physician-assisted suicide. So it's a tragic kind of upheaval in the culture, and I think kind of we need to save the culture from itself by drawing people back to first principles, to reflecting really on I would say the beautiful inner coherence of the good and the true. And that's one of the reasons that people are always drawn towards Catholicism. They realize there's a kind of a higher level or effort to always be consistent across all domains. And so, you're asking about end of life, but this will immediately extend to the beginning of life. And, it reminds us of that comment of Mother Teresa that if a society or a culture legalizes abortion, this is just opening the door for attacks at other points within the spectrum of life, and predominantly at those points where we find ourselves most vulnerable and unable to defend ourselves. When is that? That's the end of life. We're weak, we're troubled, we're lonely, we're sad, we're depressed sometimes. So, we become vulnerable to these types of approaches. So I think the task here is a tall one, but one that we really need to take with great seriousness, and it'll offer, I think, a rejuvenation of the whole culture when we return to true north, as it were, and recover this sense of the inviolability of human life from beginning to end. That's such a key thing, and it really has been lost, and we're struggling to regain that ground.
I think that's a very important point to think about the issues with medical aid in dying in light of a historical and theological understanding of the practice of medicine, that healthcare providers are meant to recognize and to act in accordance with the dignity of the person, and to intentionally bring about the end of life is certainly an act that goes against the fundamental objective of the practice of medicine. And
against the dignity of the human person.
Right.
If you affirm that dignity and on the one hand and are seeking to safeguard and protect it, and on the other hand you're taking steps to exterminate it, it's like this is speaking out of both sides of our mouths. And, it's funny how in the moral life that temptation arises to hold at precisely the same moment, mutually contradictory positions. So sometimes it's just an issue of showing people that they're doing that and, calling them back. I say to people, look, if you did that kind of thing in the way you manage your stock portfolio, you would be bankrupt in no time. It doesn't make sense. Or this notion that morality is something I make up as I go along. No, it's not. It's something you have to discern and, respect as something exterior to you. And that if you turn towards the reality of this, it's going to enflesh a new level of order in your whole being, as you become an individual who's living in accord with your deepest purposes and designs. So that's a liberating message at the end of the day. I think people see morality as kind of a restrictive, I just can't do what I want all the time sort of thing. And it's like, no, but if you're doing what you want all the time, you're hurting yourself and others. And you hardly even aware of it because you've gotten into these cycles of selfishness that run so deep in your own being. So, to find that freedom, the real freedom that ultimately, comes from Christ is a very, very beautiful thing for our people.
Yes, I think that's so true. And it's really concerning when the practice of medicine seems to be sending conflicting messages about the human person and the responsibilities to the human person. On the other side, there are also some trends, as we see in the rise of transhumanism, to try to extend human life radically. And what do you have to say about some theological reflections that help against that opposite temptation as well, that affects how we view the human body and the goods of health and well-being?
Yeah, the transhumanist project is a fascinating one. And I think it's a very dangerous one at the end of the day. It's basically this proposal that we must supersede mankind. So in other words, the current model that we have for man is inadequate. It's simply inadequate. It's broken. So we need to redesign the human being through technological, genetic advances, through implants, through cyborgization, through many approaches like that. And we need to produce man 2.0, who is going to be rid of all of the difficulties and problems that we have. And when we reach man 2.0, we're going to be looking down our nose at man 1.0 and saying, oh, what a wreck that was. Just like you might say we do now if we look down at the chimps and the orangutans. We look down our nose, oh, they're nothing compared to us, sort of thing. So there's a lot of pride in that. There's, this assumption that we actually know what is best, and that we have the power, the capability, the wisdom to be able to re-engineer ourselves in such a fashion as to create that man 2.0 and be happy with the result. And I think this is, an exercise in radical futility. And I think at the end of the day, you cannot escape the shards of brokenness within ourselves. Any new redesign that you attempt to do with man, you're always going to have the spiritual reality, and that is broken and requiring not transhumanism, but transfiguration in Christ. And that is key. Until we acknowledge that, the transhumanist project is going to be, whistling Dixie, as they say. It's not going to lead us anywhere except into, more dead ends and trouble spots, and actually more opportunities for those with power to predominate over others who are more vulnerable. I think that's going to be a dynamic that will unfold more and more as the transhumanist project gains legs and starts moving, more and more quickly in the future.
I think that's a very significant concern about transhumanism, is that it overlooks two major important points: that the way that we experience suffering is always going to be present, and technology won't be able to cure our experience of suffering in this fallen world, but also that we have access to the graces already to seek a flourishing life and to ultimately seek eternal life with God, and that we don't need anything added on technologically in order to seek those graces.
Yeah, good observations. And I would dovetail onto them and, suggest that we do live in a culture that has become convicted that the goal is to eliminate suffering. And I think that goal is flawed right at its core. Now, why do I say that? Because the coming of Jesus Christ and his suffering and death, which were, gory, awful, and unpleasant from the very get-go, it changed the meaning of suffering. And that becomes key to everything. Once you've changed the meaning and you understand this is not just, sort of brutality unleashed, but this is something that has divine repercussions, has connections to our destiny, has connections to our personal transformation, and that earlier transfiguration that we were referring to. Suddenly suffering becomes, you might say, part of the package of what we have to manage. And not just manage, but engage in a deep way to become something new. And that's a hard message. That's a hard sell. Our society really thinks, no, it's just to be eradicated. Don't give me anything more than that. This is too much. I can't handle it. And I think this is the beauty of Christianity. It really says, no, let's pause. Let's look at this. Let's look at the example of this God-man. It is the hermeneutic key to everything when it comes to suffering.
That's so well said. The fact that Christ allows us now to be able to devote our suffering to something beyond the self, and also to see suffering differently as having hidden graces and a hidden gift to empathize with him and to unite with his own suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about graces beyond ourselves, when I'm working with families and with somebody who is dying, and he or she says something like, this is so much suffering. It's this darn, bone cancer. It's so horrible. And I don't want to just be snowed all the time with high levels of morphine, but at the same time, it's awful. Then I'll say to them, what are those 3 words that our church always says to us? Offer it up, right? And I say, think about, maybe one of your sons, one of your daughters who's away from the church. If you offer this, what you're going through, it's going to have an incredible power. And they're like, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. And they're like so grateful. And it's like, okay, and suddenly you realize there's this new tenaciousness. There's a new opening within their soul, which says, all right, Lord, whatever your plan is for me, I'm going to do my best to accept all the steps here that lie ahead until I come home to you. And, it's a powerful thing for us to discover that kind of liberating message, kind of hidden within the sad and difficult mystery of suffering.
One of the difficult experiences of suffering that a lot of couples deal with is the experience of infertility. So to shift from our discussion about these bioethical issues at the end of life to now turning how to steward life at its beginning, what do you think are some of the important concerns about IVF? Because a lot of people might assume that because it involves creating life, that it should be something that is permissible or ethically beneficial. But really, there's a lot of fraught issues with IVF.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out something that actually that rises to the highest levels of our society, in the sense that even our President Trump, has framed this in that manner and said, well, we want to promote in vitro fertilization. Why do we want to promote it? Because he says this is a form of family building. So he's, using kind of a desirable thing, which is to have bigger families, more children. And then he's choosing a morally problematic means. He doesn't realize he's doing that. So what are the issues here? There are many significant issues, but I do have to say, there's this silver lining effect. I personally am grateful that the president has brought this up because, for years I have been trying to kind of get people interested in talking about IVF. And I think most of the time people, this is a private issue. Couples are struggling with infertility. Let's not talk too much about it. Let's not make anybody uncomfortable by suggesting that doing this as a way to get a baby has moral concerns. And the fact that the president brought it up now means that people feel more ready to engage the issue. And I find I'm, even being invited much more to speak about it around the country than I have in the past. So, that's the silver lining. So the issue with in vitro fertilization, a lot of times Catholics, if you ask them, why does the church say it's wrong? A quick answer, you make extra embryos and you freeze them, and that's just terrible. Well, that actually is not the core reason. Even if you make 0 extra embryos and you freeze 0 embryos, the very act of creating that life in laboratory glassware, outside the love and affection of the marital embrace, you are committing an act of injustice against your own child, and you are violating the meaning of your marital covenant right at its root and core and its fundamental design from the Lord. So this stands at the heart of the issue, and people don't see it. They're like, well, but look, if I do in vitro, I'm just giving my sex cells to somebody down the street, and I'm paying him some money to do this for me. But they don't realize this has become transactional in the way that we now are producing our offspring. Transactional, where we're controlling the whole dynamic. And when we control it, what happens? You create a subclass. There's the subjugation of your own offspring that invariably occurs because you have those who are brought into being at the level of all of us, in the sense of the marital embrace, but then you have the subclass, those who are manufactured, manhandled, manipulated, flash frozen, handed over to embryonic stem cell researchers, those who are products to be treated by a different metric. And this is automatic injustice. So, the church is very insistent and has become, I'm convinced, largely the lone voice in our culture today, insisting that this should never be done under any conditions, any circumstances whatsoever. The desire is good for children, for offspring, but this does not open up to us the allowance to do anything that we want to go after a good end. This is a means and ends issue. The ends are good, the means are flawed and fundamentally disordered, and gravely so. I use that language to remind Catholics in particular, but all men of goodwill, that when you do this, you have crossed a fundamental line. And certainly for a believer, this is a matter that requires that you go to confession. If you did it with full knowledge, freedom of the will and so on, full consent, this is grave matter that requires you find healing with the Lord. And of course, He wants to forgive us, when we make these mistakes. But I think we've become so casual about this that many Catholics are like, oh, this isn't even something that raises any sinful concerns. And in fact, it's very grave matter that they are dealing with.
And I think one of the major underlying issues is a misunderstanding of the vocation of parenthood, rather than viewing it as a gift, as viewing it as something that's simply conferred by one's own will, that the desire for parenthood alone should justify the means that someone takes in order to become a parent.
Yes, I think you're right about that. It's a sense of, well, I'm entitled to be a parent. I got married. I'm entitled to a child. I have a right to a child. Sometimes you hear that language, and it's like, oh dear, no, you never have a right to a child. A child is not a piece of property that you can lay claim to. What is it that we do have a right to when we get married? To those acts that are ordered and disposed to the handing on of the gift of life, those fruitful acts. But you're never entitled to a baby. So, I like to say to people that the beauty of the way God has set it up, the marital act is a mysterious kind of petitioning of the giver of the gift. And we have to, sure, do the petitioning, but He is the giver. And it may be part of His plan either to delay, maybe significantly delay, the arrival of that first child, or in some cases there may be what we call irresolvable infertility. And the couple is being invited by the Lord to discover new ways of fruitfulness, whether it's big brother, big sister in the community, whether it's adoption, whether it's foster parenting. These things are authentic manifestations of that male-female complementarity and fruitfulness. So we've got to learn to help people. We've got to help people to learn to think outside the box a bit here, and to realize at the end of the day, God always has a plan for your marriage. And if at the beginning it appears that there, is some difficulties, you've got to start by seeing, can you work around whatever the roadblock is? Is there a blocked fallopian tube? We could do a surgery. Is there a problem with the cycling of the woman? Is the man's sperm count too low? Are there erectile issues? Work through all of those. And a lot of times the Lord will send His blessing, but just in a time frame that maybe we were hoping it would be sooner. And it's like, no, God has His timing too. Or we may be in that situation of the irresolvable infertility again, and trusting in what the Holy Spirit is doing in marriages.
Which can be another problem of assisted reproductive technologies, is that they overlook these fundamental underlying medical conditions that can be leading to infertility, which is one of the reasons why natural procreative technologies can be really helpful in trying to address those underlying problems and assist the couple in achieving health.
Precisely. That point is an important one. And I sometimes stress to people, the way we talk about in vitro fertilization a lot of times is we say, well, you're apparently infertile. Why don't you overcome your infertility by doing IVF? Oh, yeah, okay. And it's like, Flawed reasoning, because that couple, let's say the couple has irresolvable infertility, they do IVF, they pay to have the baby made, it's implanted into her, the baby is born. They are just as infertile at the end of the process as they were at the beginning. They have done a complete substitution of an entirely different kind of act for the marital act. The infertility remains. The underlying causes, as you're saying, have not been addressed. And so this is, again, a kind of misnomer at a minimum, a misconception, really, that people have about IVF being a treatment for infertility. No, it's an alternative way of engendering life in a laboratory that has very little to do with the life of the married couple.
And in addition to addressing the direct problem of IVF as something that subjugates human life and creates it outside of the context of a marital embrace, there's also the question of what to do about the millions of frozen embryos that are frozen, that are extra from this procedure. And a lot of people have discussed, well, maybe embryo adoption can be a procedure that helps to save the lives of these embryos and then also helps a couple to have a child. But there can also be some serious ethical questions with embryo adoption too. And I know that you just recently participated in a debate about this question. What are some of your thoughts about that issue?
Yeah, I think I would preface those thoughts by saying the whole discussion on embryo adoption is a little bit, in my mind, superfluous. Why do I say that? Superfluous. Because the underlying problem is that we have an assembly line generation of, thousands maybe of human embryos each day just in the United States. The industry is unregulated. It's the Wild West of infertility. The assembly line is just churning out new embryos at an incredible rate. And so people say, then let's do embryo adoption and this will help with the problem. It's like, it's not even a Band-Aid. It's not even a tiny little Band-Aid on this massive industry. What we need first is to put the brakes. We need regulation. We need laws like they have in Germany and Italy, which says if you do IVF, you can only make a maximum of 3 embryos. You can't produce 20 or 30, in one sitting here and freeze dozens of them to keep them on ice for the couple in case they want to come back for repetitive cycles later. Can't do that in Italy and Germany. And that's a sensible law. It's not a Catholic law. Of course, a Catholic law would outlaw IVF altogether. But we need some kind of measures to restrict the practice, and we're not even discussing it yet as a society. So the whole embryo adoption thing, it doesn't make sense to my mind to even engage it in any kind of serious way, unless we can stop the conveyor belt that's just churning out new life like this. And once it's stopped, then I think we could go back and say, is this an option? But you're right, I did have this debate a few days ago in Indianapolis, and there's been an argument out there that says, well, the church has left this as an open topic. And I'm not convinced that that's accurate. And this was sort of my lead off in the debate. I said, if you read Dignitas Personae, important document that came out of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is one of the highest teaching entities within the church, it says in section 19 that you cannot use embryo implantation, embryo adoption, embryo transfer is a technical term, as a remedy for infertility. So it rules it out. It says it's wrong. So this I said, look, this is fascinating. The church has identified a clear case and stipulated in no ambiguous terms, you may not do this. Now you start to ask, okay, why do they say that that's the case? And basically 2 reasons are offered. One is that it impinges on marital fruitfulness to do this kind of embryo transfer. Now, fruitfulness understood, I think, broadly there. And the second reason is basically it appears to be a form of surrogacy, where strangers' embryos are being implanted into women who receive them. So then the document goes on and says, but there's been a proposal here, to do embryo adoption more broadly, but these same objections reappear, or something to that effect, in that same section 19. So I said at the beginning of my debate, I don't even know why we're having this debate. In a sense, it's clear that the Church does not have a completely open stand to this, and in my opinion, doesn't have any real openness to it. But there's just the way it was written. I think some of the Italians who were writing it at that point, it wasn't Cardinal Ratzinger who wrote the earlier 1987 Donum Vitae, which was much clearer in the language and choice of wording. The later one, it was a little bit not well crafted, so people could read in, maybe there's some tiny little loophole here that might allow us to somehow, under certain circumstances, maybe do embryo adoption. So anyway, that would be my take on where the Church is with respect to this matter, just looking at the documents. And I encourage people, read these documents. Don't just read what you bump into on Catholic News Service or the National Catholic Register. We all look for the Reader's Digest version, but when it comes to you as a married couple contemplating this as a possibility, please read the original sources. Do yourself a favor and don't rely on second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand treatments of this matter. So then with that sort of as the first launch point, then the second point I make is, marital fruitfulness, why is this, such an issue of concern that the Church, and what does it mean that you're sort of violating marital fruitfulness or impinging on it as you're doing an embryo transfer, and what if the husband and wife even agree to this, and the wife is being implanted with somebody else's embryo? How is that fruitfulness being attacked? And so the way I try to sort of frame this and to get people to reflect on is to share a story from my first assignment as a priest, where I got to know a family. They had 5 kids. I knew the husband and wife. The husband he wasn't a bioethicist, and he was just interested in it. He was a geochemist, a scientist by training. And I was over at their house one time, one afternoon, playing volleyball with the family, and he threw this question to me. He said, what about embryo adoption? I hear this is a possibility for all the frozen embryos. And so I immediately tried to turn it around on him and lob it back into his court. And I said, how would you feel if Heidi was implanted with somebody else's embryo? And he was a very reflective, kind of a deep thinker, paused for a little bit. And then he said, she should get pregnant only through me. And when he said that, I don't think he realized, quite how profoundly he had hit the nail on the head. And it struck me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, wow, you're right. This is exactly, and you framed it so perfectly that, your wife's fruitfulness includes her ability to gestate life. That gestation is not some add-on feature that just, accidentally appears. It's part of this integrated whole of the design, the very meaning of our bodies, in their deepest capacity for self-giving of one spouse to another. So I think that helps people to realize, that he was touching a nerve there. And we, I believe, move into the domain of embryo adoption at our own peril, truly. And maybe just last point on the surrogacy thing. We tend to use the language of adoption. Adoption is such a beautiful thing. I have 2 sisters who are natural sisters, 2 sisters who are adopted. And so we say, it looks like this is just an example of adoption. But I say to people, think about it. Look at really what's going on. Embryo transfer is not adoption, but rather surrogacy. And when you just ponder that, I think, it becomes clear, it's not just adoption. There's another step. Somebody has to become pregnant. Somebody has to gestate a life. This involves a type of surrogacy at its core. Now, some people object and say, surrogacy means you have to pay a woman and then she's going to hand over the child. But that's a very kind of overly delimited understanding of the essence of surrogacy. I'm convinced the essence of surrogacy involves this ab extra, or from the outside, implantation of an embryo into a woman so that she becomes pregnant, not through means of her husband, but through these other technical means that are utilized.
Embryo adoption is a very interesting question because we do have various Catholic bioethicists, Catholic scholars that have different positions on the issue. St. Carlo Acutis' mother writes in her book, My Son Carlo, that Carlo Acutis had an intuitive sense that embryo adoption might be permissible in the sense that it's helping to rescue embryos. I agree with you that Dignitas Personae presents some very straightforward issues with embryo adoption. If, as you mentioned, it talks about how embryo adoption should not be used as a treatment for infertility, is it possible to view it as a rescue mission for embryos? So rather than viewing it again as seeing pregnancy as something to which one is entitled to, but rather an action that is trying to save these embryos that have no other chance to continue their course of life.
Well, I think this is similar in the sense that it's a matter of means and ends. So the end is good, and you're now reframing it as a rescue end. And we can all agree that that's good. But the question here in my mind, are we using intrinsically evil means? In other words, the embryo transfer step itself, is that intrinsically evil? And I'm convinced that whenever you do IVF, and the church has not said this, okay, so I just want you to understand this is my take on this. I believe there are two evils that transpire. The first is the extracorporeal production of the human life. The second evil is that extrinsic implantation into the woman. And I'm convinced both of them are disordered right at their core. So if that's true, even reframing it as a rescue, the rescue is a good end. Adoption is good. This is all beautiful, but if the means to get there are intrinsically wrong, you can't go there. It's a no-go proposal. So the question, I think, in my mind, revolves very centrally on whether or not that is a correct statement, that this is an intrinsically evil step or not. So, I use an even more radical example. I say to people, look, what if you have a husband and wife and they make up their mind they're going to do IVF? They drive to the IVF clinic. He donates sperm. She's superovulated, donates her eggs. They mix them together, produce a dozen embryos, and say to them, okay, go home now for a few days. Those embryos have to grow. As they're driving back home, they have a discussion, and the wife says, I don't think we should have done this. I think what we just did was wrong. All right, now they're in a situation where their embryos are growing back at the clinic. Would I counsel them within a few days to turn around, go back, drive to the clinic, and have her be implanted? I would say no. I think this involves a second evil on her part. Now you'd say, all right, well then that means that the clinic's going to have to freeze them, and that's also an evil. That's true. It is an evil. It subjects those embryos to risk of death, at least to a certain percentage of them. So there's no good alternative, but this is the problem. When you cross an objective moral line, you often have no good path of exit, of egress, of, going to a better place. So, again, it depends on whether it's true or not that step is intrinsically disordered to do the implantation. Now, you start out with Carlo Acutis, and I think that's helpful because I like to remind people, just because somebody is declared a blessed or a saint, don't make the mistake of thinking that everything that they thought about, analyzed, and wrote about is automatically correct. St. Thomas Aquinas, there are many parts of his writings that don't withstand scrutiny anymore. And he would be the first to admit it if he were alive today and had the kind of knowledge that we have today, for example, about embryology. He would simply revisit the matter and make corrections. So the same is true, I think, for Acutis. The question there would be, how much real formation did he have around these issues? Was he responding in, what's a nice way, which is to say that he felt a regret and a sense of compassion towards this terrible fate, both for the embryos and for the embryos' parents, who now regret what they did. But that may not be sufficient for a complete analysis of the matter of whether it is licit to carry out embryo transfer in human beings.
I think that that's a very important analysis to make about embryo adoption, that a lot of people try to argue in favor of it just looking at the circumstances or just looking at the intention. And it's very important to think about what is the object of the act, how should we analyze the object of the act. And I agree with you that depending on what we think of heterologous embryo transfer or embryo transfer in general, really impacts our conclusion about embryo adoption.
Yeah, heterologous or homologous.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about the situation where a couple has done IVF, has repented and acknowledges that it's a wrongful act, but then they may have dozens of embryos that are still frozen in storage? What are they to do to respond to that situation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real heartbreaking situation. It's very difficult. The couples feel that the options, there's no good options. The embryo adoption discussion, I think they realize, especially when they discuss it, in depth and do some of the readings that I was alluding to earlier, that this isn't a real resolution. So I've dealt with this situation several times, and I have an unusual recommendation that I make. And on first hearing, it makes people slightly uncomfortable, but then I think they realize, oh, okay, maybe that is, pastorally speaking, what we should be doing. So I had a fellow who was talking to me. He'd ended up in a divorce, and there was a custody fight over the embryos. He ended up getting the custody. And then he came to me, very regretful of what he and his wife had done. And I said to him, well, I don't think there's any simple answer, but I'll tell you what I would do if I were in your shoes. I would set up a small trust fund and put money into it, and I would set this up to protect your embryonic children who are on ice. Now, when I say, this in case you die soon, you'll still have funds to care for your child. And they're like, oh, well, that's kind of awkward. How long do I have to do that for? And I'll say, look, I'm not going to, I can't set any kind of time on this. This is something that's a sign of your regret and a sign of your authentic desire to continue to love and care for your embryonic children in the only way you can do this. Normally, when you have kids, you got to put a roof over their head, you got to buy them food, clothing, you got to send them to college, all of which costs a huge amount of money. And now we're talking about maybe $350, $400 a year to keep your kids frozen and protected. You ought to do that, And so, and this particular fellow I was working with, he said, yeah, that's a good point. And he went out, he set up a trust fund. I don't know how much he funded it for, but, he wanted to show to himself, to the Lord, that he really regretted what he had done. And he wanted to care for his kids in this way. Now, just to sort of put another angle on this, that I think people say, well, it seems like these embryos are stuck in ice forever. And this just seems, so improper to keep them there. And they'll say things like, well, oh, isn't the liquid nitrogen just extraordinary means? And you can discontinue extraordinary means. I say, morally, it's not extraordinary means. There's no burden implied to the embryo in terms of pain, suffering, difficulties in being in the frozen state. The embryo has no nervous system, no consciousness, no awareness. There's not a lot of expense here, as I just pointed out. It's minor expense, minimal duty to care for your offspring. So it's not morally extraordinary. The benefits are very high. You're safeguarding the integrity of your own kids, and the burdens are low, very few. So you should do this. And then the question becomes, all right, but then they're going to be frozen forever, right? And I say, well, not necessarily. Don't jump to conclusions, because we don't know the science entirely around the reality of freezing and thawing human beings. There is some indication that if you keep an embryo long enough in the freezer, that because it's not absolute zero, that these embryos are held at, it's slightly above that in the liquid nitrogen. There are occasionally minor molecular movements that may still occur, and degradation remains a possibility for the frozen embryos. So we need to do some tests with, say, monkey embryos, orangutan embryos, macaque embryos, and track this. Thaw some after 10 years, thaw some after 50 years, thaw some after 100 years, figure out the rate of decay. Are these embryos dying by themselves in the deep freeze? Figure out the curve, and then we may be able to say something like, okay, after 2,500 years, all of our embryos in this here tank will have expired, and we can give them a decent burial, and the matter will be over. So people, have to understand, we don't know all the details. Don't sort of presume that this is an eternity of trapping those embryos in some way. There may, in fact, be some resolution along those lines. Granted, it's awkward, but that may be the best that we can do without ourselves becoming agents who make choices that cause the death of our offspring.
And Father Tad, how would you respond to the argument that some people make that in addition to the burdens versus benefits analysis, that there's also the determination of whether something is truly a therapy, understood as helping to restore somebody to health, that this, as Dignitas Personae mentions, cryopreservation is something that disrespects the dignity of the embryo to begin with. If it's not something that has a therapeutic purpose and isn't presently being used to restore the embryo to health, would that render it an extraordinary means, or would it still be an ordinary means?
Yeah, I don't think it would render it. I mean, you can certainly argue it's not a directly therapeutic intervention. And I think that's true. It's just a form of stasis. And the question becomes, with the power of this technology of imposing stasis, why are we doing it? And what goods might or might not accrue subsequent to eliminating the state of stasis? So in that sense, you could, use freezing technology for valid purposes or for invalid purposes. And the Church is saying anytime you do IVF and you're freezing embryos, it's for an invalid purpose, and it raises serious moral objections from the get-go. But, if there were some other situation where you had a newborn infant and you had to freeze them temporarily, maybe to hold them in a kind of stasis until you could get an organ transplant and save them, and you could do it with low risk, then you could sort of turn this on its head and say that the freezing step is, if not itself directly therapeutic, by providing the stasis, it facilitates a future therapy and therefore would be licit and morally allowable.
And I wonder, how would you respond to the argument that we have a lot of examples of other ways that couples might collaborate with other people to care for their children, like wet nurses, or arguably the healthcare institution as an extension of the family's care for one another to help provide further expertise in these difficult matters of caring for the well-being of one's family, that perhaps embryo adoption is another way that couples can assist with the vocation to care for life.
Yeah, I think the wet nurse example is a good one to ponder, because I think a lot of people do imagine that embryo adoption runs strictly parallel to that. So, you have sometimes you have American women who go over to Africa and they'll see a starving child and they'll breastfeed them, to help out the mom who has no breast milk. And isn't embryo adoption just something like that? I don't think so. I think it's very different, because once a baby has been born, that baby is now open to new relational encounters. And women's breasts are exterior and available for the precise purpose of nourishment. And this doesn't involve any kind of transgression. There's not an exclusivity written in at that level. But at the level of the generation, the procreation of life, there's this mysterious inner exclusiveness within the woman, that she is the one who bears and brings the life to term within herself. And this is not something that is open to kind of a multiplication of entities and a multiplication of different relational encounters. It is something that has an exclusivity written into it because of the nature of the bodied beings that we are. So it's an enclosed, clearly connected to her spouse in its signification. But once the child is born, already you've opened up a whole new reality, and those other types of relational encounters with wet nurses, with, et cetera, becomes possible and is of a different moral texture than that which impinges upon that highly, inherently exclusive dimension of the female gestatory capacity.
Another large question with regard to IVF is that oftentimes embryos are selected according to subjective standards or even according to whether or not they have disabilities. So this is highly problematic in ways that it incorporates concerns of eugenics. What do you have to say about some of those additional issues?
I think that it's interesting that when you do follow-up of IVF children, they do have elevated rates of birth defects. So that is known. And there is this temptation to put a eugenic pre-selection step in place, and it happens routinely. So you line up all of your 10 or 12 embryos, you look at them under the microscope, you see if they're morphologically, in terms of their shape, if any of them are irregular. You can also do what's called PGD, where you pull off one of the cells of the 8-cell embryo, test it for hundreds of different kinds of diseases, anomalies, defects. And if the embryo manifests some of these, then you say, all right, that one's not going to be implanted. We'll pour it down the sink, or maybe flash freeze it and store it forever, kind of thing. And I think this is a real concern. It's a kind of another level of collateral damage. It's another level of instrumentalizing fellow humans in such a way that we're treating them not as ends, but as means. And this is an injustice against them for us to be saying, well, you're worthy of life, you're not, you are, you're not. It's purely a eugenic reality that, pops up over and over in this arena. Also, when you implant multiple embryos, you can get multiplets, twins, triplets, quads, higher order pregnancies, and then they recommend selective reductions. And this becomes another case of instrumentalizing your children, treating them as products to be eliminated, and you go in with a large gauge needle, introduce potassium chloride into the hearts of a couple of the beating children, and so that the last one that's left over can grow bigger and do better in utero, because a multiplet pregnancy is more dangerous. So you can see this is not a life-giving technology in the way people frame it. Oh, this is all about life, it's about life. Well, you see the death-dealing edge of the sword in these selective reductions, in the embryo screening, the eugenic tendencies, the discarding of embryos, the freezing of embryos. All of this subjugates our children to, terrible fates as part of the process.
And these eugenic practices certainly detract from a view of marriage and parenthood as one that is responding to the vocation of hospitality and accepting all life as a gift.
Absolutely, yes. That mysterious receptiveness of the marital embrace, where whatever the Lord sends, we say, we pray for the grace to be open to that. This is one of the dangers of prenatal testing as well, that those types of testing should be done to prepare for the arrival, potentially, of a child who has some health issue so we can better care for him or her, not so that we can go in and conduct a search and destroy mission before he or she is born. So these technologies, they require real discernment about how to use them appropriately.
It's very different to provide therapy for a child versus to completely reject a child on account of their disability, when actually the life of disability can involve a lot of graces and beauty and joy for both the child and the parents.
Definitely, for the family and for people outside the family as well, when they see, that willingness to lovingly receive with open arms the mystery of each person.
And I think another important angle to address questions of infertility, which we've touched on already, but I think is worth expanding on, is how can the church help to care for and respond to couples who are carrying the cross of infertility that they're not able to overcome using the resources of natural procreative technologies and other resources? Yeah,
I mean, the question of how the church can be helpful and respond here is a great one. I think, so I remember one time I was giving a talk on this in, I think it was Richmond, Virginia, to all the priests there. And one of the priests, at the end of the talk, he said, look, I'm the pastor of the biggest parish here. We have thousands and thousands of families. We are so big as a parish, we are able to have our own infertility support group. And he said, couples minister to each other as they're journeying through infertility. Some of them come out the other side and, achieve many of them don't. And he said this has been incredibly helpful to those couples. And he said, I, as the priest, every so often I'll drop in as well because they may have some questions they want to share with the priest. And, I thought, what a wonderful kind of ministry. Now, big parishes could do that, but if you don't have really big parishes and you're just maybe a small diocese, certainly at the level of a whole diocese, this might be possible to have some group that meets maybe every 2 months to, share, provide support. This is critically important. And then people, won't feel so alone and isolated. Couples that are infertile, there's a way in which they a lot of times think, I have to deal with this on my own. They don't want to even bring it to their parish priest. They're not sure why. It's just it's an awkward thing in some ways. It deals with sexuality, deals with things that maybe they haven't broached previously. So in one sense, you can understand that. So finding venues via which couples can be brought to a greater level of comfort in approaching the church is essential if we're going to effectively evangelize on these issues that touch right at the core of human life.
I think that one of the important things in trying to help couples who are experiencing infertility is to lift up the full perspective of what the Catholic sacrament of marriage entails. And there's goods in addition to, but also beyond having biological children that the couples help to collaborate with each other and participate in to help to serve their community and to help each other to holiness. But also the fact that the cross of infertility can be a way that the couple is witnessing to this sacramental view of marriage and the dignity of human life in a very special manner.
Yeah, and it's also witnessing to alternative and very important understandings of fruitfulness. Even, I'm going to push it a little further. I sometimes ask my audiences, all right, you have a Catholic priest who's a pastor here, and he has an associate or 2 associate priests with him. Are your priests at this parish not fruitful? And they'll all kind of laugh at the question. Well, of course they're fruitful, but then I'll say, well, of course they don't have any children of their own, but isn't there a sense, and a very important sense, in which they truly are fathers to the whole community, all the sheep, all of these individuals in the church are their spiritual children. This is real fruitfulness. We as church image this powerfully. And you're suggesting that the infertile couple may be being invited by the Lord to also give witness in this way. And that's very, very true and very important. That we, again, step and think outside the box. It's not just about a child of my own flesh and blood, because that's the starting point, and many people never relinquish that vision. It's got to be my baby. I got to get it. I got to make this happen with the pragmatic American can-do mentality versus, wait a minute, this infertility is speaking to us about suffering, about deeper designs, about a new lease on our fruitfulness. And these are important realities to engage and not be afraid of. So we as Christians need to share that. Again, it's a form of liberating message at the end of the day.
I agree with that bearing the cross of infertility can be an act of sacrificial love for the couple that decides to forego IVF. And then also that the act of adoption can be something that allows them to empathize and unite with Christ, who himself was an adopted child of Saint Joseph. So it's another opportunity to unite with Christ in a special way.
Yes, absolutely. Very nice reflection. And I think it is beautiful. The mystery of the Holy Family, a lot of these dynamics are sort of woven into, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, and the way that each of them truly formed the Holy Family.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Father Tad. As we wrap up, I was wondering if you had some comments first about Benedictine College's new Center for Technology and Human Dignity, of which you're on the advisory board. One of the goals of this center is to help to form students to be conscientious users of technology so that their use of technology is aligned to the common good, but also so that they can become virtuous developers of the technology to ensure that from the ground up technology can be built so that it supports true human flourishing. Do you have any comments about the work of the center or some hopes that you have?
Yeah, I do have great hopes for it. And I think this is such an important mission. I saw basically a TV report recently about this game, Roblox, which is on the internet. And I was stunned to see the number of kids. In every single day, they have 153 million visitors. So I said to myself, wow, this is incredible. The technology has, I'm going to put it this way, a stranglehold over an enormous swath of our population. If they're spending time, and this is probably not just 5 minutes that they're playing these games. And so you're pointing out the importance of the proper use of technology. Just from the vantage point of making sure that we're not too distracted and focused on all the wrong things and telling ourselves, I just need, a few minutes of distraction, so I'm going to go on the internet and, get into some trouble here kind of thing. Even that is already very important as a spiritual discipline. Now, you're talking also about the importance of having developers. They were interviewing the guy, I think he was the executive VP of Roblox, and there is some forum there via which children can communicate with each other. They can't send pictures, which is good, that's restricted, but they can still communicate. And there wasn't a way to know whether, in fact, the children might be communicating with adults who would be grooming them for, sexual purposes. And so they're putting in some age verification technology to try to, tamp this down and preclude it. But these are questions of, the highest importance, because we are talking about this is the way people are living their lives today, hours and hours and hours in front of screens. And we need to have much tighter regulation and understanding, spiritual understanding around these matters. So, I hope that the center will make substantive contributions, offer insights, be, of assistance in these kinds of discussions moving forward into the future.
Yes, I think that that's well said. And the center certainly wants to help to form students to address these important questions. So thank you so much for joining us today, Father Tad.
Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to have this opportunity to vet some of these critical issues of the day.
We hope you enjoyed the Benedictine Dialogues, a production of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. To catch all the latest and support our growing platform, visit media.benedictine.edu. And be sure to recommend this show to your friends and family. Help us to transform culture in America one conversation at a time.